Hello, everybody. It's thrilling. I'm very excited to be here sharing these ideas on this project that we have with Professor Gasuli at Imperial College. As I was presented already, my name is Miguel, and this project is about an open source low-cost sensor for seismic and vibration monitoring. So, a brief outline of the presentation, some motivation, so I can share with you the inception of this project and some of the ideas behind of it. Then I will offer to you a little background on the electronics and the hardware part of it, so you are not so lost. Then I will introduce as well the sensor itself that we decided to use for this showcase. Then the bulk of the presentation will be the results of the experimental test that we developed in the college to test the capabilities of the sensor, and finally some insight about further development in this project. So hopefully there will be discussion afterwards. So a bit of motivation to introduce this. The idea of recording what really happens to a building during an earthquake has been a long-lasting challenge, especially for structural engineers, for earthquake engineers on the field of structural health monitoring. Mostly either accelerations, vibrations, or displacement strains, because those are the metrics or those physical expressions of the building that can actually be easily related to levels of damage based on the level of input in terms of loading that we have in the structure. However, and although we've seen amazing achievements in this field, the main problem is that we still have super expensive equipment and large equipment that are very demanding. We need to go there in order to have a full assessment of a building like this one, for example, a five-story building. So we came up with the idea of, okay, why if we start exploring the possibility of using low-cost sensor to actually do the same task? So inspired by some developments in the field of seismology, I'm showing you here some projects that are related to this, so low-cost accelerographs. So basically with those low-cost sensors, not necessarily open source sensors, you can record the input of the ground motion at the base of the structure. So in our case, as a structural engineer, the challenge is we're willing to record, in this case, just accelerations of the structural response of the structural system. And the main difference is actually the amplification, in this case of the acceleration. This is actually real scale and undistorted real response of a typical shear building. So you can see that as you start going up, you have amplification of the acceleration. This is something that we know, and we've compacted it on the response spectrum that we are super familiarized with. Yes, the response of single degrees of freedom, a family of single degrees of freedom under a specific earthquake. Yes, so we have one of those for each earthquake. And here you can see the same. So basically, an accelegraph is capable of measuring what's happening here at the peak ground level, and we are interested on what's happening. We need to be able to record this amplification on the signal. So this is one response spectrum from an earthquake from Chile, the 8.8, the almighty 8.8, 2010, and this is from Puebla in Mexico in 2017. So you can see that the content of frequency, the spectral shapes are completely different, although we always have this pattern of amplifying the level of demand that we see in different structures for different periods based on the characteristics of the records, not only the main period of the record, but content of frequency, etc. So this is the sensor, one of the sensors actually that we've been testing. So basically, to give you an idea, it's a low-cost sensor that has mostly 3 or 4 parts, the main part being this board. This is basically a tiny computer. Actually, you can see the peripherals here. Those are USB ports. This is an Ethernet cable for sharing or for sharing information, communications. Then you have, this is an open hardware called Arduino Uno, that it's actually our digitizer, is the one that is collecting the data from our micro electromechanical sensor. This is basically this tiny sensor there. that it's pretty much what you have in your cell phones. It's exactly the same. So with different characteristics and so on. So we've been testing different prototypes, and actually you can add some LiPo batteries, and so you can have certain autonomy. And here are the characteristics of the particular sensor that we are been testing this time, of the accelerometer actually. So you can see that for here the important thing to keep in mind is the nominal maximum acceleration, that for this sensor is plus minus 3g. Usually in the field of seismology, this is either 1g or just 2g, but we never go further. And this whole system, the whole budget is less than 100 pounds. So just quickly about the off-the-shelf components that we've been using, or we've been drawing from. We have the processor, that's basically a computer. We have microcontrollers that are acting as digitizers, and we have MIMS, that are those micro electromechanical sensors that are tiny sensors that are becoming super popular. For example, in a car, in a modern car, you can have more than 20 of those in any car. So the idea is that the computer in this case is the brain of the sensor that allows us to do a lot of tasks on the fly. Filtering of signal, communications of data, and so on. And we'll talk more about this at the end. And the digitizer is basically the one that is collecting. It's basically what you see in our labs that are used to digitize signals from analog signals to digital ones. So all these three components working together, is the bulk of the sensor. And so what we did is that we took our different sensors actually, and we put them to perform different tasks, experimental tasks, to see how they perform. So the first one was long time timeless experiment. So basically you just place the sensor and there is no motion, because we are interested on capturing the self-noise of the sensor. And I will explain you why the self-noise is super important. The second stage of tests were dynamic tests, so basically stationary signal, periodic signals, sine waves using a dynamic actuator in the lab. And then we use non-stationary, therefore real earthquake records, ground motion records using a linear shake table. And before I show you the results, that's going to be the main part of the presentation. For benchmarking the sensors, we use a PCB high fidelity commercial sensor that is an accelerometer basically, and a typical data acquisition system from National Instruments. Yes. So this is going to be our benchmark. The benchmark is not the input of the actuator or the input of the shaking table, is measuring exactly the same at the same time with a high fidelity sensor. So I'm going to refer to this as a reference or transducer. And so the general performance of the sensor, this is the self-noise. For those of you that are not familiarized with this type of things, the self-noise is super important because it's basically the minimum threshold of energy, of content of energy in a signal that the sensor can record. If you have a signal that has less energy than this threshold, we cannot record it. And if we are in the limit, our signal will be distorted, and then we need to do some signal processing and so on. So we just carried out a dozen of 12 hours recordings. We just placed this in the building, in the college. And so here you just have, you can see an excerpt of a signal. Those are 2,000 seconds. And there are different metrics to calculate the self-noise. You can do it in the time domain. In this case, it's just roots mean square of the time acceleration series. And usually the values that we have here, it's around 1% of G. That for this type of sensor is pretty good. And you can perform the calculation of the self-noise in the frequency domain. And basically here you can see that for the 3 axes of the sensor, you can see that there is a good match with the specified level of self-noise provided by the vendor of the accelerometer. And in general, those values are comparable to high-fidelity sensors, as you will see in a bit. So then we did some box flipping tests that are actually very simple tests yet super powerful. Basically, you just grab the sensor, you start in one position, and then you rotate it in the 6 possible positions in the 6 degrees of freedom until you come back to the initial position. So here you start with Z axis going up, and you start rotating the sensor. So the idea is to see if at the end of this static analysis, you have any remnant or residual displacement on the signal without an input motion. And in general, the mean values on those regions that are actually where the sensor is completely static is 0. Then some general performance on the dynamic test with periodic sinusoidal waves. So basically here we are interested on building up the transfer functions. The transfer function of a system is basically a ratio between, in a given system, a transfer function is the ratio between any metric of the input signal to what is coming out of the system. So in this case, we are trying, of course, to measure the amplitude of the acceleration. So in this case, we have a sinusoidal wave that has a frequency of 5 Hertz, and you can compute those transfer functions, the amplitude response, either again in the time domain or in the frequency domain. The main drawback in the time domain is that you are including the whole noise of all the frequency, all the whole bandwidth that the sensor is capable of recording. So we did this in the frequency domain, so basically you just narrow band the main signal and you remove all the rest of the noise, and we did it in this way. Here the same for another signal with a main frequency of 8 Hertz, and again we use those 5 peaks around the main signal in order to perform the transfer, to build up the transfer functions. And as you can see here, those are the transfer function of our sensor. So basically we are interested, we were looking to see this flat behavior. So basically this is just the ratio of the amplitude of the acceleration of the observed versus the reference being the high fidelity sensor. And in general, for a given amplitude and different frequencies, you have a flat behavior up to 16 Hertz. That is the maximum installed capacity of our jack in the college. And in this side, it's the other way around. You fix the frequency and you start increasing the acceleration in order to reach the maximum capacity of the sensor, that in this case is 3G. So here the clipping is basically the capping of the signal as you reach the maximum capacity. Other sensors that we tested were, for example, when we saw some anomalies, because when you were reaching the maximum capacity of the sensor, they were seriously distorting the signal. That is something that by no means we want to see. But in this case, for this particular one, we have a flat, good response. The interesting thing here is that those dashed lines at 1% out of the amplitude ratio, it's usually the threshold for high fidelity sensors. So then, for a particular couple of sinusoidal inputs, this is very relevant for us as structural engineers, because in general we are interested in being able to recover the displacement just knowing the acceleration signal, time series. So in this case, you can perform the integration of the acceleration 2 times, and you can retrieve the displacement. So in this case, you can see that we successfully recovered the displacement, and you can see that there is some gobbling behavior in this region, and this was just the jack that before reaching a steady state, it was sort of ratcheting, and it was interesting that the sensor is capable of recording. And then a more funnier part is the seismic response. So for this part, we selected over 50 records that we categorize in 3 groups. The first one is far field records, the second one is near field records with the pulse, and the third one is just near records without pulse. So, and here you can see an extra metric of the whole 52 records, that is the area's intensity. Usually we use the area's intensity because it's a proxy of the amount of energy that the earthquake has, therefore give us an idea about the destructiveness of the earthquake, the potential of destructiveness of the earthquake. So we use those ones to feed the shaking table, and here are some of the results. So here you can see the time history response and the fast Fourier transform of a far field record. In general, very, very good results, close match between this is the sensor and this is the reference high fidelity sensor. Good results in terms of peak acceleration, peak velocity, peak displacement, amplitude, and distribution of frequency. The same for near field records. And then a spectral response for a far field record, actually the same record as before, and you can see that in the spectral response, this is the response spectrum, very good match. However, in the Arias intensity, the sensor tends to underestimate the response. And this is basically because if you remember, the Arias intensity is the integral of the whole time series of the acceleration. So basically any tiny error in any peak of the signal, you start accumulating towards the end. And this is all those measurements were taken under 200 samples per second. That was the sampling rate of the sensor. So we managed to overcome the situation if we increase the sampling rate to 400, 600, or 1,000. But I wanted to show you the original results because those are comparable at 200 samples per second. So then, of course, we are interested, we need to quantify the error in different metrics of interest. So the mean square error of the whole time series, the entire time series of acceleration for all the records. It's basically the mean square error, and the same for the Arias intensity. In this case, for the Arias intensity, we are using the logarithm of the Arias intensity of each record because we know that they are logarithmically distributed within records. And so you can see here the mean square errors, in general, less than 1% of G, with those some outliers, but in general, most of them are very low. The same for the Arias intensity. We still need to work here to overcome the situation that I just showed you in the previous slide. Then we measure the error in the acceleration response spectrum, and for this we were drawing from what has been done in seismology field, and basically here you can some statistics. You can compute the statistical error or the bias in the computation of any period in the response spectrum. So basically you just start, I'm not going to go into the details of this, you just start by calculating the difference with the reference signal. So this gives you an idea of the error or the bias that you are inducing in the calculation of any of these periods each time you use the sensor. And here you can see that the bias is actually pretty low and tends to be sort of flat. But here the important thing is not that those values are around zero. The important thing here is that can we repeat the experiment and obtain the same response? So this is the robustness of the system. Because if we know that the bias is always the same, we can erase it from the results and correct the data finally. So in order to do that, then we pick a couple of just 2 individual records, and we repeated the test 7 times using the shake table in order to, so here you can actually see the response spectrum of all the individual records, the reference signal, and the mean of the sensor. And then we perform the same procedure as I showed you before, and in general, the bias tends to see very similar, and we can repeat it in general. There is a reproducibility there. So the important thing here is, again, if we know the bias for any period, then we can correct signals. To start finishing, some current and further developments, it's towards the autonomy of the sensor. So we are exploring the use of different types of batteries and different protocols of communication, wirelessly transferring data. That is actually something that we've been doing so far. So we've managed to send data using Wi-Fi and GSM to a server and collect the data of one specific sensor with quite good results. And just to give you a hint of the kind of things that you can do with this kind of sensors is that so far most of the sensors that we use for structural health monitoring are what I call passive sensors. So basically a sensor that is only capable of performing one task. So you go there and you just retrieve a piece of information, temperature, humidity, acceleration, strain, or whatever you need. But the possibilities of sensors like this one is that we have a tiny computer embedded on it. So you can perform tasks on the fly. And so far, for example, in structural health monitoring, machine learning techniques are used in this way. You have a structure, you develop a twin model, or just what we've been doing for decades, a structural model. We simplify the model in order to analyze the structure thousands of times or hundreds of times, and we train, for example, a neural network, and then we can use it to estimate or predict certain patterns in the signal that we retrieve. So the idea is that you can do this and then deploy those trained algorithms into the sensor in order to the sensor to sort of become self-aware and move towards the data-driven decisions. So the sensors are actually quite capable of undertaking these tasks. So these are the remarks, basically what I just showed you. So I'm not going to read this. I just want to convey one final message for you guys. Those things are not about the noisy data or the quality of the data, because it's more about how we deal with this noisy data. Because keep in mind, or bear in mind, that most of the strong motion records that you are using every day for doing your dynamic analysis on seismic analysis were recorded in the last decades using sensors that did not have even half of the capacity, sensitivity, and reliability of the sensors that you have embedded in your pockets. So thanks. Thank you.